My mother-in-law grabbed the microphone at my husband's burial and told the whole church she killed my son. She collapsed when the pathologist stood up to speak. The pastor reached for the microphone to stop her. Too late. She had already said it. She killed my son. The words hit the ceiling of that church and fell down on 400 people who believed her. What none of them saw was the man in the gray suit stand up quietly from the back row, straighten his tie, and say, "Actually, I need to correct that." The organ had been playing for 20 minutes before anybody said anything wrong. Greater Zion Baptist Church, Atlanta, a Saturday in October. White lilies on every pew. The smell of candles and pressed suits and somebody's grandmother's perfume. 400 people came to celebrate a wedding. Darnell and his bride, Keisha, glowing in ivory. But you could feel something older and heavier in the air, something that didn't belong to newlyweds. Diana sat near the back, not hiding, not lurking. She sat the way a woman sits when she has decided she is done being afraid of a room. Straight back, hands folded in her lap, black dress, simple. No jewelry except small gold earrings her mother Ruth gave her when she turned 30. She looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere after a very long walk and was not about to pretend the walk hadn't happened. She was 39 years old. Her husband, her ex-husband, had been buried from this same church 14 months ago. She had sat in the front row that day until she was told she wasn't welcome there. The reception program sat folded on her knee. Inside, between the dinner menu and the toast order, was a section titled, "In Loving Memory." A photograph of her late husband, Elijah, a small tribute paragraph, and the quiet, unspoken implication, which everyone in the room had been raised on, that grief is a thing the family owns, and that Diana had forfeited her share of it. She had almost not come. She had held the invitation for 3 days before she called Dr. Osei. 3 years before that moment, she was a different woman in a different life. Not worse, not better. Just ordinary in the way that most good people are ordinary. Making dinner, paying bills, going to work, loving somebody, believing it was enough. 3 years before that Saturday, Diana believed that doing everything right would protect her. That if you were loyal and patient and good, loyalty and patience and goodness would come back to you. A lot of us were raised on that same belief. Some of us are still waiting on it to prove itself. If you're watching this story and you know somebody who has been accused of something they didn't do, somebody who was called a name in front of people who mattered, somebody who lost their community before they lost their case, stay with this. Because this story isn't just about what happened to Diana. It's about what happens when the truth finally gets to speak. Like this video. Subscribe if you haven't. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been blamed for something you had nothing to do with? Diana worked in the billing compliance department at Northside Medical Center in Atlanta. She had been there 11 years. She was good at her job in the quiet, reliable way that doesn't get celebrated at company parties but keeps everything running. Her supervisors trusted her. Her co-workers liked her. She brought cookies on the last Friday of every month, not to be liked, but because she genuinely liked doing it. She and Elijah had met at a church function, of all places, a community dinner at Greater Zion 7 years earlier. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with laugh lines and an easy way of talking to strangers that made everyone feel like they'd known him forever. He was a general contractor, built things with his hands, took pride in it. He called her Di. She called him Eli. They bought a small house in Decatur, 3 bedrooms, a backyard with a fig tree that never produced any figs, which became a running joke between them every summer. They were not rich. They were not struggling. They were in the careful middle, the place where most black families in America live, working hard, building slow, grateful for what's solid and scared of losing it. One evening, maybe 8 months before everything changed, Elijah came home with a manila folder of paperwork. He'd been to his doctor for a routine physical and was updating his life insurance policy, consolidating the documents into one place. He dropped the folder on the kitchen counter and went to shower, calling out from the hallway that dinner smelled good. Diana flipped through the folder absently while she stirred the pot. Policy number, beneficiary forms, some routine correspondence. Tucked between 2 pages was a letter on medical letterhead, a preliminary findings summary from his physician. She scanned it without fully reading it. Something about cardiac markers, a recommendation to follow up with a cardiologist within 60 days of the letter's date. She noticed the date. The letter was 4 months old. She thought, I'll ask him about that at dinner. She didn't ask him at dinner. The conversation went somewhere else, and she let it. She told herself she'd bring it up over the weekend. The weekend came and went. There was a cousin's birthday party and a problem at work she was managing. And then another week passed, and the question that had briefly lived at the top of her mind quietly sank below the surface of daily life, the way questions do when the urgency isn't yet visible. She folded the letter and set it on the counter. Later that week, when she was straightening up, she put it in the kitchen drawer where miscellaneous papers lived. Takeout menus, old receipts, the spare key to her mother's house, things you mean to deal with later and keep meaning to. It disappeared into that drawer. It went quiet. She had no way of knowing, standing in that kitchen, stirring that pot, that the letter she was putting away would one day be the only thing standing between her name and a lie that had been building for years. The first signs were small. That is always how it begins. Small enough that you can reason your way out of what you're seeing. Small enough that saying it out loud sounds like paranoia, sounds like insecurity, sounds like the kind of thing a difficult woman would say. Elijah started working late. Not every night, maybe twice, 3 times a week. He was a contractor. Projects had phases. There were reasons. He had a phone call in the car one Thursday evening that he ended too quickly when she knocked on the window to ask if he wanted dinner warmed up. He said he was handling a bid. She said, okay. She warmed the plate. There was a Saturday in March when she touched his arm in the kitchen, and he flinched in a way he had never flinched before. Not dramatically, just a subtle tightening, a pulling back, like a man whose mind was somewhere else and whose body had forgotten to be patient with the person it lived with. She looked at him. He smiled. She let it go. His mother, Gloria, had always been a particular kind of woman. Diana had understood that from the beginning and had made her peace with it. Gloria Beaumont was 61 years old, had raised 3 sons alone after their father left when Darnell was 4, and had never fully forgiven any of her daughters-in-law for existing. She was not a cruel woman, exactly. She was a possessive one, which is different. She loved her sons with the fierce, consuming love of a woman who had been let down by every other man in her life. And she viewed the women those sons married as competitors for a resource she had spent decades protecting. But something shifted that year. Gloria stopped calling Diana by her name, started calling her Elijah's wife, even directly to her face, even at the dinner table where they'd sat together for 4 years. At a family gathering in April, she told Elijah, in front of everyone, that he worked too hard and had too many burdens pressing on him. She let her eyes travel to Diana when she said the word burdens. It was done with precision. the kind of precision that comes from rehearsal. Diana smiled and passed the sweet potatoes. But at night, when the house was quiet and Elijah was asleep beside her, she lay awake, running the math. What was adding up? What wasn't? What she was afraid to say out loud because naming it would make it real, and making it real would require her to act, and acting would require her to know something she wasn't yet certain she could survive knowing. At church one Sunday morning in May, Diana arrived early for women's ministry setup and found 3 women in a conversation that stopped the moment she came through the door. She recognized the quality of that stopping, the forced naturalness, the overly warm greetings, the busy redirect to table arrangements. She had seen it before in work environments where something about her was being discussed. She smiled at all 3 women and got to work setting up the folding chairs. She mentioned it to Simone over the phone that night. Simone, who she had known since their freshman year at Spelman, who had stood beside her at her wedding, who knew Diana better than most people on earth, told her she was reading too much into things. "Girl, church women are always in somebody's business," Simone said. "That ain't got nothing to do with you. You know how Elijah gets when he's got a big project going. He's stressed, and you're picking it up. You're spiraling." Diana wanted to believe her. She let herself believe her. But the community was its own thing, and it was the most insidious because it was the slowest moving. Greater Zion was Elijah's church in the foundational sense. His family had been members for 40 years. His father's name was on a memorial plaque near the entrance. His mother helped organize the women's ministry and the annual fundraiser and the Christmas program. Diana had joined when they married and had given herself to it genuinely. She volunteered for things that needed doing. She attended Bible study on Wednesdays. She never missed the women's ministry meetings. She brought her cookies every last Friday of the month. She had believed, in the way you have to believe in order to give yourself to something, that the community would become hers as much as it was theirs. That year, it began to take itself back. The church mothers who had called her baby started giving her the short nod. The nod that says, "I see you, but I don't know you." A deacon's wife, a woman named Sandra, who had always been particularly warm to Diana, was in conversation with another woman at a potluck in June. Diana was coming around the corner with her hands full and caught maybe half a sentence. Something about Elijah deserving more. She couldn't be certain of the full context. Sandra looked up, saw Diana, and changed the subject with a cheerfulness that was too fast to be natural. Diana set the pot down on the table and smiled and served herself some of the greens. At a cookout in July at Elijah's cousin's house, Elijah corrected her in front of everybody. She had said something. She can't even remember now precisely what it was. Some small opinion about a neighborhood development going in nearby, the kind of take anyone might have. And he cut her off mid-sentence. "That's not how that works, Di," he said, in a voice that was flat and dismissive and utterly unlike the man who had called her Di with tenderness for 4 years. His cousin laughed. One of Elijah's friends said something under his breath that she couldn't catch. Elijah did not look at her to check if she was okay. Diana laughed too, because that is what you do when the room has signaled that your embarrassment is the acceptable social outcome, and you are not yet ready to refuse the signal. She went home that night and sat in the backyard by the fig tree that still had not produced any figs, and she let herself feel the first full, unmediated weight of what she knew was happening. Not everything, not the specific names, not the full financial picture, not the depth of the architecture that had been built around her. But enough. She knew enough in her body, in the animal-level intelligence of a woman who has been loving someone and paying close attention, that the life she thought she was living had a different structure than the one she had been told about. She went back inside. She went to sleep. She did not yet look in the drawer. She came home early on a Thursday in November because the billing system at Northside crashed, and they sent non-essential staff home at 2 in the afternoon. She pulled into the driveway of the house in Decatur, the house they'd picked together, the house with the fig tree and the guest room they'd argued pleasantly about whether to paint sage or gray, and she heard his voice before she was fully out of the car. Elijah was in the garage with the bay door down, talking on his phone. She could hear him through the side door that was cracked open maybe 3 inches, just enough to let the November air move through. His voice was low and urgent, the way voices get when the words matter and the space feels porous. She stood at the door with her work bag over her shoulder and her keys still in her hand. She heard a name, Candace. She heard him say, I know, in the soft, worn-down tone of a man managing someone else's feelings carefully, someone whose feelings he valued more than the effort. She heard him say, she doesn't know anything, and she understood in that instant that the pronoun was hers, that she was the she, that she didn't know anything. She did not push the door open. She walked back to her car and sat in the driver's seat and waited. 45 minutes. She watched the garage door. When it finally rolled open and Elijah came out and saw her sitting there, he startled. He actually startled. The genuine physical jolt of a man who has forgotten what he left at home. How long? She said. He didn't ask what she meant. That told her everything she still needed. How long, Elijah? He told her it had been about a year. Candace was someone from their church. He said it like a confession, like a weight he had been tired of carrying. And Diana noticed, she could not unnotice it, that somewhere in his face, beneath the appropriate guilt, was a measure of relief. He had been putting this down for a year. She was about to pick it up for the rest of her life. She did not throw anything. She did not scream. She went inside the house and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. And then she got up and made dinner, because the body keeps requiring things of you, even when your mind has gone somewhere it doesn't know how to return from. But that was not the worst of it. The worst came a week later. She began looking at things, looking the way you look when you have finally given yourself permission to see, when you stop making accommodations for what you are afraid to find. She went through their bank statements, not because she suspected financial betrayal, she had not gotten that far yet, but because she needed to understand the full architecture of the life she had actually been living versus the one she had believed was hers. She found the statements in his truck's glove compartment, tucked under the registration papers, folded inside a grocery store receipt, an account she didn't recognize. Her name was not on it. The deposits started 18 months ago, small at first, 300 here, 500 there, amounts a busy woman managing a household might not notice, missing from a joint account that was always being added to as well. And then the amounts had grown. She sat in the front seat of his truck in the driveway at 8:30 at night, and she added it up on her notepad, pressing the pen into the paper. $42,160, their savings, moved out in increments, in 18 months. She called Simone. She needed to say it out loud to someone who loved her, someone who had known her since she was 18 years old and crying in a dormitory over a biology exam. Someone who would be as undone by this as she was. Simone was quiet for too long. Simone. Diana, She stopped. There was the particular quiet of someone arranging words they have been holding for a long time. I didn't know about the account. I swear on my mother I did not know about the money. But I knew something wasn't right. Between him and Candace, I heard something at a cookout, maybe 4 months ago. And I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the one to bring it to you if it wasn't what it looked like. I kept thinking maybe it was nothing. I kept telling myself you would know before I did if it was real. Diana set the phone down on the kitchen counter. She did not hang up. She just set it down and walked to the back door and looked at the fig tree in the yard. And she stood there with her forehead against the glass until Simone's voice, small and apologetic and arriving 4 months too late, faded into something she could not hear anymore. 3 betrayals, all of them in the same week. The husband who had loved her and then replaced her while using her name on the mortgage. The family, because Diana understood now that Gloria had known, that the dinners and the cold shoulders and the whisper campaign had been preparation, had been the community being readied for a version of events that required Diana to be a certain kind of woman. And the friend who had seen something and decided her own comfort was worth more than Diana's right to know. She stood in her kitchen, the kitchen of the house she had helped choose, standing on the floor she had helped tile, looking at the fig tree they had planted together as a joke about patience, and she understood, with total clarity, the complete loneliness of being right about something you had spent months hoping was wrong. Elijah filed for divorce before she could. He had a lawyer. Diana came to find out later that Gloria had been in contact with the attorney for several weeks before Elijah had even had the full conversation with Diana. The legal preparation had been completed before she was given the complete truth. She was positioned before she could position herself. She hired a lawyer late, with money borrowed from Ruth, because so much of the joint savings had already been moved. The proceedings were not drawn out, but they were thorough in their damage. She lost the house. The opposing attorney presented their financial history in a way that made Diana appear to have been a passive beneficiary of Elijah's income rather than a contributor to their shared life, which, in their documentation, was technically arguable, because Elijah had managed the household accounts and Diana had trusted him to do it, and trust, she was learning, can be used against you in court. Pastor Edmonds called her privately. He was not unkind about it. He used phrases like season of transition and what's best for the congregation's healing and given the family's history here. The church moved quietly, but completely. Diana sat in that phone call and translated each phrase into its actual meaning in real time. She had been a member for 6 years, and she was being asked to leave without being accused of anything specific, which is a particular kind of expulsion, the kind that leaves you with nothing to appeal. She collected her things from the women's ministry storage room on a Tuesday morning when no one else was there. She put them in boxes, she put the boxes in her car, and she drove away from the parking lot of Greater Zion Baptist without looking in the rearview mirror, because she had learned that there are some things you cannot afford to keep watching. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, on a gray Wednesday in February, Diana received a call from Northside Medical Center's hospital liaison unit. Elijah had been brought in by ambulance. She arrived at the hospital before Gloria because of a paperwork processing delay she had not created and could not have anticipated. She sat in the waiting room alone for 30 minutes before the doctor came out. She asked if there was anything they could do. The doctor said no. She sat back down. When Gloria arrived and saw Diana in the waiting room, something moved across her face that was not grief. It was calculation. It was the look of a woman who has just been handed something she didn't expect and is already figuring out how to use it. By the time the funeral was arranged, the story had begun to form. Diana was the woman who had been there first, who had been alone with him, who had called the family too late, who had never properly explained herself. Gloria did not say it directly at the funeral. She was too precise for that. She said it in hallways and repassed conversations and phone calls. She told the story in a tone of confused pain that let other people fill in the gaps with their own conclusions. She said things like, "I just don't understand the timeline," and "there are things we still don't know," and let the implication do the work that an accusation would have done if she'd had the courage to make one outright. At the repast, a woman Diana barely recognized said, loud enough to be overheard, "Well, nobody really knows what happened at that hospital." Diana turned around. The woman looked into her potato salad. Diana went home. Her apartment was a single bedroom in College Park, small and new, with no history in it. She sat on the floor, the couch hadn't been delivered yet, and she ate crackers and sliced cheese, and she did not call anyone because she had gone through the list of people she trusted, and the list was now very short. She was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. The kind of tired that comes from spending months smiling in rooms where people are deciding things about you. She was going through a moving box looking for her lease paperwork when she found it. She had packed it without thinking. The whole contents of the kitchen junk drawer, swept into a box and closed up and labeled miscellaneous. The way you pack things when you're moving fast and desperate to be somewhere other than where you are. The folded letter, still crisp, still dated, still there. She unfolded it on the floor of her College Park apartment, and she read it, actually read it this time. Not scanned, not skimmed, read it the way an 11-year veteran of medical billing reads a clinical document when she decides to pay attention to it. Elevated cardiac markers. A recommendation, underlined, for cardiology follow-up within 60 days of the letter's date. The letter was dated 14 months before Elijah died. She sat on the floor with the letter in both hands, and she stayed there for a long time. She didn't fully understand its legal weight yet. She didn't know yet what a pathologist would eventually tell her about what the language in this letter actually meant in the context of Elijah's death. But she had worked in medical billing for 11 years. She understood clinical documentation. She understood what a follow-up recommendation meant, and what it meant when it wasn't followed. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her purse, not back in the box, not back in a drawer. Her purse, where she would know where it was every single day. She ate the rest of her crackers. She lay down on the floor of her new apartment, and she slept. She didn't announce her rebuilding. That was the thing about it that nobody who had written her off would ever understand. Quiet progress looks exactly like defeat from the outside. It looks like a woman who left and fell apart and disappeared. That's what Gloria told people. That's what the women at Greater Zion believed. They weren't watching when Diana registered for night classes at Georgia State. They weren't there when she sat in a healthcare compliance course at 8:30 in the evening with a full day of work behind her and a textbook she'd paid for herself and a notebook she filled to the margins. She found a new church in East Point. Small congregation, maybe 80 people. A pastor named Reverend Coles, who preached like a man genuinely trying to understand God rather than represent him. Nobody knew her name there. She sat in the third row, and she sang slightly off-key, and she let the anonymity settle around her like something offered. She talked to her mother every Sunday. Ruth didn't try to fix things. She mostly listened, and sometimes she said, "You still standing?" And Diana would say, "Yes, ma'am." And Ruth would say, then, "Keep going." She kept going, without announcement, without an audience. 18 months after Elijah's death, Diana passed her compliance officer certification exam on the first attempt. 3 weeks later, she accepted a position as compliance officer at Atlanta Regional Medical Network, 2 levels above her previous role, with a salary that made her sit in her car for a moment after the offer call before she let herself feel it. She moved to a better apartment in Midtown. She opened an investment account. She bought the couch she'd been wanting for 2 years. Before she bought the couch, she took the letter to a former colleague who connected her with Dr. Elbert Osei, a pathologist who had been involved in reviewing Elijah's official autopsy findings. He was 61, gray at the temples, a man who spoke with the precision of someone who had delivered difficult truths in clinical settings for 3 decades. He met Diana at his office and went through the documentation methodically. His conclusion was clear. Elijah had a documented hypertrophy cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle that had been present and measurable years before the divorce, years before any estrangement. The preliminary letter Diana had found was an early clinical indicator. The cardiology follow-up that had been recommended had never happened. The cardiac event that killed him was the predictable consequence of an unmanaged condition. There was no foul play. There was no ambiguity. There was a man who had not taken care of himself and a condition that had run its course. Diana listened without speaking until he was done. "If someone publicly accused me of causing his death," she said, "would you be willing to say what you just told me? On record?" Dr. Osei looked at her steadily. "Ms. Beaumont," he said, "I would consider it a professional obligation." She drove home and sat with it for a week. Then the wedding invitation arrived. It came in a cream envelope with gold lettering. Darnell Beaumont and Keisha Simmons. The ceremony and reception at Greater Zion Baptist Church. Diana's name and address, her new Midtown address, printed on the envelope in careful script. Keisha had used an old family contact list. A mistake. No one had caught it. Diana left the invitation on her kitchen counter for 3 days. She knew what it meant if she went. She knew what it meant if she didn't. She had been called a murderer in whispering rooms across southwest Atlanta for over a year. She had been quietly excommunicated from a community she had given 6 years to. She had never been given a specific accusation to respond to, only the ambient, gaseous form of a lie that you can't grab because it has no edges. She called Dr. Osei. She told him about the invitation. She asked, without asking directly, whether he might be willing to attend. He said he had a conference in Birmingham that weekend, but that he would make it work. She RSVP'd yes. The morning of the wedding, she was dressed by 10. Black dress, the simple one. The gold earrings from Ruth. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror for a long time, not examining herself, not rehearsing, just letting herself be seen by herself, the way you have to sometimes, not for anyone else's benefit, but because you need to confirm that you are still entirely there. At 11:15, Dr. Osei called. Car trouble outside Birmingham. He was waiting for a tow. He didn't know if he'd make it in time. She stood in her kitchen in her black dress with the phone in her hand. She thought about the floor in College Park. She thought about Ruth saying, "You still standing." She thought about the folded letter in her purse, which had been in her purse every day for 18 months now, which had waited in a kitchen drawer for 14 months before that. She put the phone in her purse, next to the letter, and she drove to Greater Zion. She arrived after the ceremony had begun and slipped into a pew near the back. The church looked the same. The lilies, the high windows, the organ, the particular smell of a room full of people who know each other's grief and joy in equal measure. Darnell and Keisha stood at the altar, and Diana watched them and felt something clean. She was glad for them. That was true, and she let it be true. After the ceremony, the reception began in the fellowship hall. Dinner, toasts, and then the memorial tribute began. The DJ lowered the music. A slide went up on the screen. Elijah's photograph, younger, smiling, the laugh lines she had loved from the beginning. A few people in the room wiped their eyes. Diana folded her hands in her lap and let herself look at him. She had not hated him at the end. She had not been able to afford that. Gloria came to the microphone. She was dressed in champagne silk, immaculate, the kind of woman who treats grief as a performance requiring appropriate wardrobe. She spoke about Elijah, his laugh, his work ethic, the pride she had in her eldest son. There was real feeling in some of it. Diana let it be real. And then Gloria looked up from her notes. She looked across the room. She found Diana's eyes and held them. "My son deserved better than what was done to him," she said, her voice shifting, dropping into something harder than grief, something with an edge that had been sharpened over 2 years of daily use. "We never got the truth. We never got a real explanation. All we got was silence from the one person who should have said something." She paused. "I am standing here today saying what I have been saying for 2 years. She killed my son. She stood by and she let him die, and she has been walking around this city like she has nothing to answer for." The room went still. The pastor moved toward the microphone. Too late. The words were already in the air, already falling down on 400 people who had no reason yet to question the woman in champagne silk at the microphone. Diana did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she breathed. And then the side door of the fellowship hall opened. Dr. Elbert Osei walked in, gray suit, slightly out of breath from the drive. He paused inside the doorway, read the room with the efficiency of a man trained to assess situations quickly, and found his way to an open seat 3 rows from the front. He sat down. He adjusted his coat. He folded his hands. He looked at Diana. She looked at him. The room began to find Diana the way rooms do when something unspoken is shifting. Eyes moving from the woman at the microphone to the woman sitting quietly near the back, and then to the unfamiliar man in the gray suit who had walked in from nowhere and then back again, trying to triangulate meaning from the geometry of where people were sitting. Diana stood up. She walked to the front. Slow, straight. The walk of a woman who has decided that whatever is about to happen will happen with dignity or not at all. She did not look left or right at the faces she recognized, the women who had given her the cold nod in this same building, the deacons who had watched her leave without a word. She did not seek out anyone's expression to read it. She stood in front of Gloria. She did not reach for the microphone. She extended her hand and waited, open and patient. Gloria looked at her. Something moved beneath the surface of her face. Not guilt, not yet, but the first tremor of the ground shifting under something she had built. A Beaumont uncle in the front row, an older man named Roy, who had always been quietly decent, stood up and gently, without ceremony, took the microphone from Gloria and handed it to Diana. "I'm not here to fight with anyone's grief," Diana said. Her voice was steady. No performance, no trembling. The voice of a woman who has said hard things in quiet rooms and learned that steadiness is its own kind of power. "Grief is real, and it belongs to this family. I'm not here to take any of it." She let that settle. "I came here today because I believe the truth honors Elijah more than silence does, and I have been silent for 2 years. I'm done." She reached into her purse. She took out the folded letter. She held it where the room could see it. Not theatrically, just visible. A real document with a real date on real letterhead. This is a preliminary medical findings letter from Elijah's physician. He received it 14 months before he died. I found it in our home. I am going to let the physician who reviewed the official autopsy findings explain what this letter means, because he can speak to it more accurately than I can. She looked at Dr. Osei. He stood. He introduced himself, credentials, professional role, his involvement in the autopsy review, with the calm efficiency of a man who does not require the room's approval to be believed. He explained the medical condition clearly. He described what the preliminary letter had indicated. He walked through what the absence of a cardiology follow-up had allowed to progress over 14 months. He stated the official cause of death without ambiguity. He said he had no uncertainty about his findings. He said there was no evidence, clinical or otherwise, of any external cause. He sat down. The room was quiet in a completely different way than it had been when Gloria spoke. That silence had been the silence of a crowd receiving an accusation, stunned by its directness. This silence was the silence of people recalibrating, facts settling into a space that had been occupied by a story for so long that the story had started to feel like the truth. Diana looked at Gloria. Gloria had gone still, not collapsed. Still, the kind of stillness that happens when the performance has nowhere left to go, when the audience is no longer watching the performer and is instead watching something else. Her hands were at her sides. The champagne silk suddenly looked like a costume. "I didn't kill your son," Diana said. Quiet, no raised voice, no shaking. The matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a thing that should have never needed to be stated. "But I spent 2 years letting you say that I did, because I was grieving and I was tired, and I thought the truth would eventually correct itself. I was wrong to wait. What you have been saying about me is not true. It was never true. And I need everyone in this room to know that." She looked out at the congregation. She let them see her face. Elijah was not a perfect man, but he was not murdered. He had a heart condition that was documented and unaddressed, and that is what took him. Nothing else. Nobody else. She set the microphone on the table beside her. She walked to the door. She did not look back. She called Ruth from the parking lot. Atlanta afternoon, warm for October. The sky, that particular shade of blue that feels like a clean start. She sat on the hood of her car and waited for her mother to pick up. "How'd it go?" Ruth said. Diana thought about the room, the silence after Dr. Osei sat back down. Uncle Roy handing her the microphone without being asked. The look on Gloria's face when the ground stopped holding. "I said what needed to be said," Diana told her, "and then I left." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You still standing?" Diana laughed, the first real, full laugh in a long time, the kind that comes from a place that surprises you. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I'm still standing." She drove home through Atlanta with the windows down. She did not feel victorious in the sharp, bright way movies suggest vindication feels. What she felt was closer to the morning after a long illness. Not triumph, but the particular relief of a weight that has finally been set down. The lightness of something being over. She had been called a murderer in a church. She had lost her husband, her house, her community, and the friend she had trusted most, all inside 18 months. She had slept on the floor in College Park and gone to night school and rebuilt her life in the hours after work while the woman who lied about her was still being believed. She had carried a folded letter in her purse every day for nearly 2 years without knowing exactly when it would matter only knowing that it would. She had done all of it without becoming bitter. That was the thing she was most quietly proud of. Not the certification, not the title, not the salary. The fact that what had been done to her had not changed the kind of woman she was, that she had kept going without hardening, that she had stayed alive long enough to let the truth speak. Some people, when they are wronged, spend the rest of their lives ensuring that the person who wronged them feels it. Diana understood that impulse. She had felt it in the kitchen with the bank statements. She had felt it in the parking lot. She had felt it every time her name had been dragged through rooms she would never be invited back into. But she had also learned something in the quiet months, in the night classes, in the Sunday calls, that the truth does not need you to be loud. It just needs you to stay alive long enough to let it speak. She made it home. She made tea. She sat by the window and watched the city move through the last hour of afternoon light. She thought, I survived that. I survived all of it. And I am still here. That was enough. For now, that was everything. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't. New stories every week about people who chose to keep going when the easier thing would have been to stop. And this week's question, what would you have done in Diana's place? Stayed silent and moved on, or walked back into that church? Tell us in the comments, because the answer says something about you, and we want to hear it.